Alright guys, so that was a turbulent start to what's going to be a somewhat turbulent video. So this is the review of the San Martin Turbine Pilot. And that's where our first issue comes in. Is this actually a pilot watch? Personally I'd say it isn't, but that's up to you to decide once you've watched the video. But there are some other things with this which are quite unusual for San Martin, but we'll get into that as we get into the review. So I'll quickly move the watch to one side, briefly show you the packaging in passing. So it's the standard San Martin packaging you get with most of their watches now, so I'm not going to go into detail. And here is the actual watch. So you can see now why it's called the Turbine Pilot, because that dial is actually looking like a turbine, which is pretty cool. Not something I've seen before. If you've seen something similar, let me know down in the comments though. But before we get into this any further, let's go over the dimensions. Because based on my measurements, they're not matching up with San Martin's on the listing, which is unusual. Normally San Martin get them spot on, but I've checked a couple of times and I'm getting a few of these different, so we'll go through them. So the diameter is listed at 39.5, but I've measured it at 40. It's a little bit awkward to measure because we have actually got crown guards on this, but I'd definitely say it's more of a 40 than a 39.5. Then when it comes to the thickness, that's 11.8, that's the same. Then unfortunately we have actually got a lug width of 21mm. I wish they'd just gone for 20 or 22, but it is what it is. When it comes to the lug to lug, they're saying it's 46.5, I've measured it at 48, and again I've measured it a couple of times to make sure. This is why I never just take the listing specs for granted, I always make sure I check them myself. So when it comes to the weight on the bracelet, with all the links included, it's coming at 146 grams, and then size for my 7-inch wrist, it's coming at 142, but we'll get into why it's not that different in a minute. So let's take a closer look at that clasp and bracelet and talk about them in a bit more detail. So we've got the applied San Martin logo on there. And then if we turn around to the side, we've got no micro adjust. That's because we've got the on-the-fly adjustable clasp, which is nice to see. I do like these, they are very good. And this is why that weight difference between all the links and the sized one isn't that much. So I don't have to take out the extra link. I just use that instead. And it works really well. So you've got a decent amount of adjustment there. Now moving on to the bracelet, you can see we've got screw links there. So that's good to see, definitely my preferred method. And then when it comes to the finishing, we've got polished sides there. And then we've got the usual sterile case back, which is screw down. The bracelet is a pretty standard plain one, so it's mainly brushed, with just as I said earlier, those polished sides. Flicking around to the head of the watch, we'll talk about that in a bit more detail now. So this is where I think it definitely can't be classed as a pilot watch, because the style of case they're using here is definitely not a pilot style one, especially with those crown guards there. And just the style of crown. If we'd had a nice onion crown on it maybe, perhaps it could have been a bit more pilot style, but it's nicely finished, again, mainly brushed. And then we've just got that polished chamfer detail on the edge, as well as the female end links, keeping that lug to lug down, despite not being as small as they list. And it integrates nicely with the case as well. And then we've got that nice brush bezel with a polished edge. And you can also see that flat crystal, no curvature on that at all. But now let's get on to the main part of this watch, and that is the dial, because it is, as I say, something I've not seen before, and it is quite a cool effect too. When you're looking at it head on, you can't really notice it all the time. Sometimes it kind of disappears, but then when the light catches it, it definitely starts to pop. Kind of gives an almost sunburst effect maybe, and it is inspired obviously by the engine on a plane, which is why I'm assuming they're calling it a pilot watch, despite the rest of the watch not being pilot style at all. So, although it might initially look like the indices are applied, they're not. They are actually raised off the dial though, so they do have a little bit of depth to them. And the San Martin logo and also that automatic text at the bottom have got this similar kind of effect too. When it comes to the hands, we've got those nice broad pilot style hands, and then that triangle up at the top again. So you can kind of see where they're getting the pilot influence from with the dial. And it is actually a two-piece dial, so that minute track, again, that is actually a separate piece, and it's got like this raised effect, which is slightly higher than the dial, and it's kind of got a bit of curvature to it as well. So we know we've got a flat crystal on this, but the question is it sapphire? Let's check that out now and find out. Using the trusty diamond selector too. And yep, we've got sapphire crystal, so always good to see, and kind of expected with San Martin watches at this point. So we've got a fixed bezel on this, so we're not going to be doing the bezel action. So now we're going to talk about the lume. Is it any good with it not having applied indices, but with them being slightly raised? Will that affect the lume or not? So you can see we've got a bit there already, but let's charge it up, give it a proper chance. And there you go. So as you can see, we've got plenty of lume on there. so much so it's actually reflecting off the inside of the crystal, giving it a kind of halo effect around the outside. Is pretty cool. So we've actually got BGWX1 on this, so that's why it is so good, at least initially. Got no patchiness, consistent across the hands and the indices, despite the indices not actually being applied. A little bit disappointing we haven't got any loom on that second hand. Would have been nice if we just had a fully loomed second hand. But with the loom on the minute and hour hand, you can see it's glowing that much, on that minute hand especially. It's actually reflecting off the dial slightly, so you can almost see that San Martin logo underneath. So that is a good sign. But the question is, what is the longevity like? Let's speed this up now and find out. So as you'd expect, initially not much of a change, but the further we go into this, you will see that the indices do start to fade a little bit. Not as much as you'd expect though, because they are quite big, they can still get a good amount in there. But the further this goes on, they do fade a bit, and the hands pretty much stay exactly the same though. So definitely usable. I'm not really sure why the indices are now looking blue, because they are actually still green. The camera's going a little bit funny there. So they are basically the same colour as the hands still, just not quite as bright. So as I say, pretty impressive loom, given it's not applied indices still. So now, let's talk about the movement on this. And as you probably guessed, yep, it's the NH35. A little bit disappointing. Would have been nice if they used the no date specific NH38, because we don't have a date window on this. So if we unscrew the crown, pop it out to the first position, and then you will possibly hear that date clicking over. So we'll have to pull it out again. And the second hand stops, so we've got hacking. And then we can just change the time. And then pop it back in, second hand re-engages. And then we've got hand winding, all works well. Again, as I say, just a little bit disappointing they haven't started using the no date specific NH38 for their watches now. Some other brands on AliExpress have started doing that, so I think San Martin need to as well. So the only other thing to really mention is the fact that we've got 100 metre water resistance on this. Again, that's kind of in keeping with if it had been a Pilot style watch, but I think with this kind of style case, and that screw down crown and screw down case back, it could probably do better than that. Don't quote me on that though, because I haven't tested it. So all it's left to do now, show what it's like on wrist, go over the pros and cons, and then you can decide whether you want to pick one of these up or not. And here it is on my 7-inch wrist. So, does wear nicely I think. And you can probably see now what I was talking about with that dial. Sometimes you don't quite see the turbine effect on it. When it comes to the clasp, because we've got that on the fly adjustable clasp, sizing isn't an issue at all, get the perfect fit. I do like that polished bezel and the polished chamfer details on the case, just catching the light, just adds that little something extra and makes it pop. I think overall it is quite a good looking piece, and you can see now what I was on about with that lug to lug measurement. I definitely think, well, I know it is 48mm, not 46.5 as they say on the listing, but it still wears well because we've got those female end links. But now let's get on to some of the negatives with this one, and the main one being that 21mm lug width. Definitely would have been better if it had been 20 or 22, because 21 is just awkward when it comes to different straps. Not a lot of people have 21mm straps readily available. I personally think 22 would have suited this quite well. Would have balanced the case out quite nicely, because you've still got a taper on the bracelet too. And the only other real negative, as I mentioned earlier, is that movement. They need to start using the no date specific movements for the watches now. I'd also really like it if they started using some Miyota 9000 series movements, just to mix things up a bit and get that nice high beat movement in some watches. Obviously that will mean an increase in price, but I know quite a few people would like that, or at least the option. Perhaps they could have an option of different movements, or even the PT5000, which I know some people aren't keen on, but I've got pretty good experience with them now, never had any issues with any of them. So overall, I think it's a pretty nice watch, although it is a little bit basic when it comes to the bracelet and the head of it. It's just all about that dial really. But if you want something a bit more interesting, I've got a few down here which might interest you. I'll leave links to them up in the top, and also the link down in the description to the playlist for all the other San Martin watches I've reviewed so far. So let me know down in the comments, what do you guys think of this one? Is that dial enough to keep it interesting, or do you think the rest of the watch is a little bit too plain, a bit too basic? There's some good specs going on, but I think design wise it is lacking a little, apart from that dial obviously. San Martin might not like me saying that, but I've got to keep it honest. I'm not going to tell you a watch is great if I don't think it is. I'm not saying this is bad by any means, but it just needs a little extra something I think. But if you disagree and you are still interested in picking one up, link is down in the description as always. That is an affiliate link. It does help support the channel, but you don't pay any extra. But that's it for this one. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.